Boa tarde.
Good afternoon. Today we have come to the closing of the Art and Education Seminar with lots of learnings that we have gathered over 3 days of talks, conversations, and presentations of the 11 finalist projects of the seLecT Award. Our guests and finalists have presented the several dimensions of life that are articulated with art and education. Art education and housing, art education and literature, art education and contemporary indigenous culture, art education and decolonization of thought, art education and dissident narratives that have transformed into political bodies. In a nutshell, art education because everyone is endeavoring to change a reality. Each project is the seed of a fight, and they have shown us that educational dimension and transformational dimension of these struggles. Luis Kamnitzer said in the opening of the seminar that making analysis of the function of the artist in contemporary society says that politics and art have to go hand in hand so that they merge into one thing and not only illustrate each other. It is also essential to think art as a processing of knowledge and not as a means of production, and this was the reflection about the dialect art and politics proposed by artist and professor Dora Longo Bahia, especially in this moment when the society cannot deal with discrepant or divergent opinions and differences. Today, in the last day of this seminar, we also have the inputs of this debate of curator and educator Sepake Angiama from London and urban planning activist Tainá de Paula from Rio de Janeiro, in talks moderated by Professor Caio Honorato. The online experience of this event, hosted in São Paulo, has given us the possibility of bringing authors from far. And also, we have gone through beyond the borders and we have grown our networks, including of partners. We have also got another brand that will also value art and education in our country. Now, with Arapuru, we have created a new category, an award to foster the development of a project. So today, starting at 6 p.m. Brazil time, we will be pleased to expand the awards to 5 projects. Apart from the traditional main categories, artist and trainer, with awards at worth 20,000 reais each, we also have the Camisa Educação category, a partnership with Gentil Carioca. We now have the Arapuru category for the development of a work in which an artist and a trainer will receive 6,000 reais in 3 installments. In order to face disinformation and devastation that are now being placed as state policies in Brazil, and also for the sadness of this political and health crisis, we'd like to thank the network of partners of seLecT Award, the support of Almeida Indeio Gallery, co-promotion of Itaú Cultural, as well as the attentive and passionate work of the team composed of my friend Gisele Bilgeman, co-editor or co-publisher of the first years of the seLecT magazine and president of the jury of the seLecT Award. And jury members Renata Bettencourt, Moacir dos Anjos, Luana Fortes, Valeria Toloi, Gianni Lima, and Heloísa Buarque de Holanda. Now I would like to pass the floor to Eduardo Saron, our partner and CEO of Itaú Cultural and a vital partnership of this event. Long life to the Art and Education Award. Thank you. Paula, we have come here. Good. Even within this context that you have highlighted very well, health problems and the problems of inequalities, all of us mourning the more than 100,000 deaths For those who said that this was something that would just go through very quickly, when we look at the facts, we see a reality of inequality that is now is screaming even more. And we are very sad about so many deaths. But art and culture cannot stop. The world of education and culture cannot stop either. Paula, I would like to congratulate you and your team at seLecT for this another edition of this award, and also to make things happen, even though virtually. Of course, here we cannot show our affection being close to each other, but now we have different possibilities. For example, we can go have a nationwide reach, and we can also have other guest speakers that are even more qualified because we now can take advantage of this digital world. At Itaú Cultural, we are very happy to be able to be a partner of seLecT. seLecT does not only have the history of this award, but also it has strengthened something that is very important to us in the world of art and culture. You have heightened the power of cultural journalism. This is something that makes us this moderation, the critics, and the specific glance that needs to establish a dialogue with ourselves, with us who are within the context of art and culture, but also with all the society. So being together with seLecT and being together with this award is something that only reaffirms the importance of art and culture as the pillar of democracy, is the pillar of the democratic state of the rule of law. So this strengthens this sense. And more democratizing access, which is important and relevant, I think that we have come to this stage in a need to move forward even more. But as we put education, culture, training, and culture with the different and relevant experiences in this field, we have the light on experience. But this also brings us to another topic that is very important, which is democratization of access, which is contained in all this, but not necessarily in democratization of access, which is participation. This award stimulates the field of education, but also it stimulates the exchange, the coming and going of people, so that people can participate in the creative processes. They can also participate in the art field, and they can also interact with the communities and cultural institutions. And the exchange and this new arrangement of repertoire is something that is very typical of participation. Without participation, there is no democracy. Without participation, we cannot go deep into the subject and in his transformation, the transformation of the setting. This is why Itaú Cultural wants to be together in this effort. And this is a very wide front, which is also consistent, permanent. And this is all for the expansion of the democratic horizon. Once again, democratization of access is very important. But it does not cover participation. Participation is really the one that makes democratization to access even stronger. And this is where we find a different sense, which is the sense of cultural democracy, and which is very much present in this award. We can make this exchange in a very generous way, and we hope that it becomes stronger. I'd like to thank you, Paula, and your team. I would like to thank Giselle, who also coordinated the jury members or the selection team, and especially Valeria Toloy, who dedicated a long time, not only to have this partnership, but also for her contribution, and with this, you could participate very actively in this process in a very intensive way. Long live the project, and I hope to be together in the next edition. And I hope that the experience of this edition may also help us in the expansion of participation, also to strengthen democracy.
Eu não sei para quem que eu passo a bola agora.
I don't know who I pass the floor to now. Thank you, Saron. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, before we start, just an announcement. Just like we did last Tuesday, in the end of the two talks, we're going to have a Q&A session. But there is something different, because now we have to restrict more to the time, because we have to finish at 6 p.m. Because right after that, we're going to have the announcement of the winners of the seLecT Award. I have the honor to introduce Sepake Angiama. She is a curator and educator with an interest in discursive practices in social contexts, dedicated to the collective rewriting of how we understand the world. Today, she is the artist director of INIVA, the Institute for International Visual Arts in London, an institution which was created in 1994 under the leadership of Stuart Hall. Before that, from 2015 to 2017, she was the head of education at Documenta 14, where she started the project Under the Mango Tree, whose title refers to the book of Paulo Freire titled A Sombra das Mangueiras, but also to the Mango Tree Grove of Santiniketan, a school with outdoor classes created by Tagore in 1905. She was also head of education for Manifesta 10 in 2014, and more recently in 2019, co-curator of the Chicago Architecture Biennale. Sepake brings us a talk, Under the Mango Tree, How to Practice Being Together. Sepake, you have the screen. You have 40 minutes.
Thank you, Kayo. Hello, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Sepake Angiama, and I am, as Kayo said, the artistic director of the Institute of International Visual Art, and one of the initiators of a self-organized gathering of unlearning called Under the Mango Tree. Firstly, before speaking today, I would like to thank Paula for the invitation, as well as Luana and Marcelo and all those people who are working behind the scenes to make this a very special moment before the announcement of the winner today. I also wanted to say that we find ourselves obviously in very troubled times where we are juggling multiple commitments. The need for artistic practices that go beyond the realm of what we understand as the art world to be have only increased their significance. So thank you for all your persistence, and it's always a pleasure to speak within the Brazilian context, as I have been inspired time and again, not only from my encounters in Brazil, but also because of the different models of our architecture and education practices, past and present. It is also a context of convergence of narratives, indigenous, African and European, that continue to have entangled resonances today. I'm going to share my screen with you now for the presentation. It's been a difficult time for many of us in these last 6 months, and many of us have suffered loss one way or another, perhaps loss of a loved one, but also loss of sociability, of coming together and of intimacy, of passing conversation on the street, and of the unplanned and unexpected, and this is something I rely on so much in my work. I talk of intimacy here in the context of education practices. as an opportunity to get closer to others, to be able to voice and to listen, a true space of exchange, although those spaces also require a good amount of time, patience, and vulnerability too. So much of my practice relies on intimacy, but one thing I have enjoyed is reading to others, reading texts by those Black feminists to whom I turn and often find so much strength to continue my work. The other thing to say is that Under the Mango Tree would not be possible without the many conversation partners and organisers that come together to make it possible. And so I would like to thank, for the last edition, the invitation of Sanchayan Ghosh, Tara Lazrado, Carmen Jose, whose illustration is here, Nikolai Olenikov, Claire Butcher, Vincent Tao, Bobby Sayers, the Forest Curriculum, the Harvest School, and Demandra Prasad, Directory Borrow, Shamila Samant, Jorge Gonzalez, Priya J, Rossio Tejada, and Taylor Cruz and Manjur Ahmed. So today I'm going to speak using a number of different registers, flowing between poetry and texts that I have written and written by others, using my experience in different situations as my primary source. We sometimes fail to trust our own experience and our own voice, but this is a practice, and we continue to experience, we find articulation of language, and this movement between doing something, reading out loud, reading collectively, writing and further conversation is a continual flow of movement which forms the discourse that we are engaged with. But I will also be reflecting on the practices of other artists and pedagogues and those who have influenced my thinking and doing. She wanted to talk about circles, about forms that go around and come around, about circular forms that ripple, that return, that revolt and resonate, that curve, about bottoms, and bellies, the soft curvature and form. That pleasing line that returns on itself, like the cupping of clay, and how balls feel in your hand, about open circles with fissures and breaks and spaces for one more. The shape that our bodies make when they are fetal, curling up into a ball when in fear, or feeling sick, or wanting to make yourself small. She wanted to think about the form we make in the womb, the proximity between two bodies, the roundness of bowls, of columns, and the seduction of a curved wall. Of the curved corner, of curved things, that line that goes around and comes around, that rolls, that repels, that rebounds, that relates, a circle, a round relenting circle, resonates, that ripples, that responds, that returns, that rattles, that goes around and comes around, that responds to the sound, that echoes, that rebounds, that line that would rather continue along its way. A revolution of sorts. Circles are very important for Under the Mango Tree, a gathering of artist-initiated schools, libraries, spaces of unlearning, of decolonisation, an unravelling of thought, a thinking through bodies while resonating with other bodies. Form a circle. That's how the first gathering began. Sanchayan asked us to form a circle in front of the Friedrichsjanum, just under a tree planted by Joseph Beuys. Instead of mango trees, our walk through the park was lined with oak trees that were planted by Beuys and transformed the city. Rabindranath Tagore was perhaps thinking of another way to transform our bodies in space, planting mango seeds in the dry terrain of Santiniketan to form classrooms, bodies of thought, finding shade under the mango tree. The entangled roots of the gathering under the mango tree gleaned its inspiration from the many radical pedagogical thinkers and spatial art education practices. Rabindranath Tagore, Lina Bobardi, Paula Freire, Ivan Illich, as well as bringing together 10 schools, initiatives and libraries whose practices derived from such radical lineage. The etymology of the word radical I learned from Emmanuel Pratt, who organizes Sweetwater Foundation in the south side of Chicago, a land-based education that seeks to think about the neighborhood as a commons, comes from pertaining to the root, So when we talk of radical education practices, we think of practices and writing that aims to challenge, uproot, and destabilize conservative forms of institutionalized learning. We see learning as active, constantly shifting and evolving, exhausting, and yet very much alive. The practices brought together from very different geographies share the struggle against banking knowledge-based forms of exchange and strive for the biophilic rather than a necrophilic education. Unlearning transactional forms of knowledge as though the student is an empty vessel collecting wisdom from the master, and instead to identify the tools needed to pursue self-education, to decolonize, to embody, to experience, to make and do. Coming from the etymology of education to draw out and lead forth, how can the congregational, the coming together, the being with produce new forms of learning which replenish and not simply extract? As one of the contributors to Under the Mango Tree, Jorge Gonzalez, who will host the next edition in Puerto Rico, describes, how do we construct other forms of we? Indeed, the mango tree, with its delicious fruit and seductive smell, is a site of learning that allows us to activate all our senses for learning with each other. The first of these images being Sankanikatan, the Bode of Peace, the Nobel Prize writer and poet Rabindranath Tagore, whose father Maharishi Rabindranath Tagore bought 20 bihas, approximately 5 acres, of land from the landlord of Raipur, Nilbolpur, 150 kilometers from the city of Kolkata, West Bengal in India, and built a garden house and named it Sankanikatan, the perfect place for meditation and contemplation within nature. After his father established Sankanikatan as a spiritual center in 1863, Rabindranath explored the idea of an experimental school, which began with an equal number of teachers and students and called it a Brahmacharya Ashram. Later, becoming a university, Visvavarti, in 1921. The motto of the university speaks to Tagore's vision of the global village, Yatra Visvam Bhavati Kanidam, where the whole world can find a nest, which follows the idea of education as a holistic field in which teacher and student work together in a circle of communal learning under the shade of mango groves, Arma Kunja. Rabindranath's idea was to devise a curriculum that creates harmony with all existence, in which its roots dug deep in connecting with the locality, but its resonance and attraction would stretch far beyond the remote lush greens and the red soil of the locality. An education grew out of open-air classrooms and a connection to nature, and indignant turn away from shut-in classrooms and the European models of exam-driven frontal learning, which he felt stifled his own learning. A celebration of seasonality rather than religious rituals, an awakening of the senses which embraced expression through the arts. She is our own, the darling of our hearts, Sankanikatan. Our dreams are rocked in her arms. Every time we see her, for she is our own, the darling of our hearts. In the shadows of her trees we meet, in the freedom of her open sky. Her mornings come and her evenings, bringing down heaven's kisses, making us feel anew, and that she is our own, the darling of our hearts. The stillness of her shades is stirred by the woodland whisper. Her Amalaki groves are a quiver, and the rapture of leaves. She dwells in us and around us. However far we may wander, she weaves our hearts in a song, making us one in music, tuning our strings of love with her own fingers. And we ever remember that she is our own, the darling of our hearts. Rabindranath Tagore is often described as a polymath. He becomes well known in Europe as a poet, and for the first from India, or indeed from a non-European descent, to gain recognition through his poetry and writing, gaining him a Nobel Prize for Gindan Gitanjali, or as it is translated, song offerings. What is most striking about Tagore is what he does with the prize money from winning the prize. He takes the money to invest back into the school. He believed that the students should not have to pay for their education and that they should experience a freedom to learn not hindered by this concern. This meant that much of the travel and lectures that Tagore gave internationally were for the ongoing support and upkeep of running a school. Before we gathered in Sankanikatan, the women from the close-by village prepared the ground for our registration. They drew a large circle on the ground and leavened the earth in a circular motion. They used the same method that women do to finish dwellings in the area using a mixture of cow dung and sand. Over the next couple of days, it dried while they also prepared a place for cooking and eating together. This was the second edition of Under the Mango Tree, the first taking place between Athens and Kassel. But Sankanikatan had been the inspiration. The invitation from Sanchayan Ghosh, the head of painting department at the art school, came at the end of the first edition. He attended the first edition and considered that another gathering could commemorate the 100th year of the school. The art school was founded in 1919, in the same year that Bauhaus was formed. Bauhaus training in the foundation year found the importance and relation between the body, movement, and the creative force. But today I'm not going to focus on the formal aspects of learning, but rather to think about practices that bring us back to ourselves, being fundamental to our own learning and unlearning. Today I would like to focus on these practices of unlearning as a form of praxis. In the practices of schools that we brought together, there was a need to collectively rewrite knowledge, not only in terms of how we understood knowledge to be, but also how to untrain ourselves. I saw that the schools, libraries, and initiatives that we brought together recognized their practices as extensions of their own thinking and being and processes of learning. How can you think through the body if you have spent years being conditioned to think that to listen is to sit still? To be attentive is not to fidget, and to focus the eye on the one that is speaking. Through my time as a teacher, I have found that using the hands to concentrate on something else generates another way of being together. The nature of the conversation and dialogue shifts. The haptic allows for a connection to others that is not pressured and flows, allowing for silences and chatter. Another thing within my schooling that I was discouraged from doing was talking. And I like to talk a lot. Talking was my way of understanding what the task was at hand. If I knew how to do something, the pleasure of showing others how to do it was too much for me to resist the opportunity. In my schooling was not encouraged to speak. I was encouraged to stay silent. Because as far as the teachers understood, if I was silent, I was being receptive. And while silence has its uses, it's important to know that speaking has its uses too, not only to demonstrate knowledge, but also as a form of transmission and translation, expression, and to enter into dialogue. Potentially, it's in the speaking that understanding is consolidated, but we are not encouraged to enter into dialogue with those who teach us. The role of the teacher is to teach, and the student, therefore, should soak up what is being taught. A voice, a small voice. A small voice speaks. A small voice speaks from within her, and she doesn't move her lips. Remaining very still, she listens to hear if the voice will speak again. She only hears her breath this time as her chest rises and falls. She becomes aware of the noises that surround her. The repetitive trill of an early Sunday morning bird, and the dry dragging sound of the wheels of a car as it drives up a hill. One sound of a church bell and a cry of a small child, creating the setting of a quiet Sunday morning. But this voice that spoke from within her, spoke so softly, clearly, and without confusion, and with perfect clarity. It's time to wake up. She would often wake up to her inner voice, trying to make sense of the world, solving problems from the day before, resolving arguments, creating solutions and making plans. Her inner voice was quietest at night and always awoke her. the cacophony of too many voices from the events of the days passed through her. But in the morning, there were very few sounds to challenge her inner voice. Get up, there's so much to do today. She takes in another breath, focuses on the blue sky, and awaits further instruction. Closing her eyes, she realizes how much her inner voice sounds like her own voice. Pondering on how she could hear it, she becomes stuck in her thoughts. Did she train herself to hear this voice? Upon reflection, perhaps the voice had always been there. The insanity of possessing another voice speaking from within was most likely developed while in school, or from trying to hear the voice of God while at church. When writing and reading, pupils at her school were asked to work in silence. Only the scratching of carbon pencils on paper and the flipping of pages to be heard. She had struggled with reading in silence and had trouble identifying different voices in narrative texts. She often couldn't tell who was speaking. This did not stop her from trying to decipher the voices, for the words on the page would remain as encoded symbols without an articulation of the voice. Who was speaking? Was it the writer, or had they crafted another narrator? The narrator in her mind should be neutral and without bias. This was also why she struggled to follow a story being read to her. While the reader subtly reflected the nuances of the text, the articulation of the words from the page pushing up from the diaphragm, the air passing over the larynx and the trachea to be manipulated by the tongue, the air squeezing past the tongue and the teeth created a wave of sound that oscillates mid-air until they reverberate around the skin of the outer ear, spiraling down into the inner ear, cocooning the sound into 3 connecting bones, surrounded by a balanced liquid. The information travelled to the brain to decode the sound symbols as something meaningful, attacking like rapid gunfire, the manipulation of sound into a language of meaning. But instead of following the flow of words, she would drift and converse with her inner voice, one word or a sentence acting as a trigger. I'm often asked the question, how do you unlearn? And what does it mean to unlearn? Well, for me, it was a journey that began in trying to recognize my voice. When I talk about my voice, I talk about the consolidation between the inner thought and my outward expression. This is often something that we struggle to do, and much of our education is about guiding this outward expression. But I think that very much of what I think about when I think about unlearning is recognizing that often we are not at the center of our own story. Our voice can often be discentered, and that is the root of many grassroots movements whose continual struggles are galvanizing change. What could it possibly mean to dissenter whiteness from our education, to recognize and value other knowledges? What could it mean to rupture this space, to no longer tell the story of the one that we name the victor, but to listen to the voices that have been for so long marginalized, silenced, othered, and even erased? When I think of this question, I also think about so much about non-human life. A number of the practices I'm inspired by consider land-based learning as central to the formation of design of coming together. To come under the shade of this mango tree with such deliberateness and to experience the fulfillment of solitude emphasized my need for communion. While I am physically alone proves that I understand the essentiality to be with. Through Under the Mango Tree, our shared or collective aim was to share and broaden our understanding and knowledge of artistic initiatives critically positioned outside of the Western canon. Is it possible to transform old structures into new ones? We were interested in collective forms of knowledge production, centered other forms of knowledge, or in some cases, indigenous forms of knowledge, as well as finding ways of creating non-hierarchical settings. In preparation, we looked to a text written by Frere from his text Pedagogy of the Heart. As he sits under the mango tree in solitude, he recognizes the value of what it means to be with. As well as sharing practice that we discovered is that through the workshops and the moments of gathering, we were also practicing what it meant to be with, and that togetherness is not a given. When you stand in a circle for the first time with a group of people, that you do not know. You are not together. You are not yet a group. You have found your common ground. You have not found your common ground, even if you are all drawn to be in one place at one time. You are a group of individuals. What I have learned is that togetherness is a practice that requires time, demands attention and focus, and requires active listening, not only to others, but also to yourself. And it's through this back and forth exchange that a connection is forged. I would like to focus on the second half of this talk to discuss some of the practices that we have brought together through Under the Mango Tree. It will not be a conclusive list, but perhaps it helps us to give a sense of the nature of these practices in the ways they have come together. And for the first gathering, the contributors firstly met over the series of days in Athens. We occupied the old university library of the Athens School of Fine Art. By ways of introducing ourselves, we also shared connections that we had with others in the group. I also asked each contributor to bring a seed. Perhaps this was more of a symbolic gesture than an unethical attempt to shift the ecology, but each of us brought something that we wanted to plant in terms of ideas. What did we want to grow in ourselves and each other? At the time of Documenta 14 was taking place, and the art school and the exhibition there were focused on pedagogical methodologies and included some of the work of contributors. We invited two guests from Ciudad Abierta, Open School, from the School of Valparaiso, or the School of Architecture and Design at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Valparaiso, which was founded in the 50s by a poet and architect with a strong view of the offices and their relationship with the poetic word. Many other artists and philosophers joined this idea, and in 1965 developed a trip called the First Travestia. A trip started in Tierra del Fuego and finished in Santa Cruz de la Sierra. The main question formulated during this trip was the meaning of being American, and to give origin to the poem Amareda. After this experience, it was necessary to create a place where the poetic word and the acts remain together, and mostly the union between life, work, and study. And so the Open City presents a place or a land in America in front of the Pacific that unifies the words and the acts. It remains open through the hospitality presented to all the members of the school, corporation, and inhabitants. Ciudad Abierta is also an experimental campus in which some questions about design, architecture, and the shapes related to them, or to other artistic disciplines, can be studied. It is also a campus of research and projection for the students in the community of School of Architecture and Design who attend the class all together every Wednesday. I have not yet had the chance to visit the school, but one of the difficult conversations was to explore how this school views the landscape in relation to the indigenous people who have worked and lived in these territories, for whose very existence, ways of being and knowing are forcibly erased through the legacy of settler colonialism. We invited Woodland School, an ongoing project with no fixed location or form. First instigated by Dwayne Linklater, Woodland School were looking to make critical engagements with the realms of representation, film, contemporary art, land and politics in Turtle Island and beyond. It emerged out of Linklater's investigation into Indigenous artists based in Northern Ontario in the 1970s, who were engaged with both ancient and contemporary Indigenous art forms. Each iteration of Woodland School brings into being a commitment to address the lack of structural inclusion of Indigenous people, both historically and in the present, in the multiplicity of institutional spaces. It is a conceptual and physical space for Indigenous people, with Indigenous people deciding its directions, structures, and functions. One of the things I loved about Woodland School was the boldness to completely rethink how, as an Indigenous artist, you can work with institutions. One thing I learned from them was how important it is to recognise that for so many, education can also trigger the violence or trauma of schooling. A schooling that can be structurally racist and attempts continually to erase your existence. In Woodland School's 2017 project in Montreal, SBC Gallery of Contemporary Art had been renamed and operated as the Woodland School. The Woodland School is negotiating structural shifts and limitations while programming drawing a line from January to December. A slow exhibition that unfolded over the course of a year in the series of 3 gestures that centered indigeneity through art objects, performances, and discursive events. Woodland School extended that gesture to Documenta 14, bringing artworks from Turtle Island to be installed in the Stelwerk at Kulturbahnhof in Kassel. Writing for grants and also self-organising. We did have support locally by the Shergill Foundation, but we did have some continuity from some of the participants from the first edition to the second. One of the things that was interesting for me was to see the ways in which we communicated after the first gathering. I had a selection of old postcards that I had bought in the market in Kassel, and I distributed them to the contributors and asked them to put their addresses on the cards. And then one of the artists, Nikolai Elenikov, who is part of the 2 different schools, the Freehome University and the School of Engaged Art, took all the postcards and created a collage and drawings on them. Later on the following year, he sent them to everyone as a reminder of the commitment we had made to meet again. But of course, over time, initiatives change and some came to an end and found new energy in other forms. Coming from Canada was Vincent Tao, who attended the first and second edition, brought a way of thinking about our relationships to bodies and books to consider the library as a generative, productive space for learning. Notes on political ecologies, NOPE 2016, was an institutional experiment that assembled a collection of 6 emerging artists, writers and researchers, and invited them to appropriate 221A's exhibition space as a site of communal study between June and August 2016, with the guidance of 221A's librarian Vincent Tao. The collective convened twice a week to plan and carry out an investigation into institutions' intimate surroundings, Vancouver's Chinatown and downtown East Side. These overlapping neighbourhoods have historically been a vital nexus of struggles for immigrant and working class power, Indigenous sovereignty, and the right to housing. At present, this contested terrain is besieged by a campaign of resurgent capital investment, economic revitalisation, or eviction, displacement, and gentrification in brief force. Using 221A as an entangled space of study embedded in the geographic centre of this struggle, NOPE in 2016 tasked its participants to interrogate with hopes of transforming the roles of artists and their institutions in the rapid redevelopment of Vancouver. Due to the work of Vincent Tao and the engagement of the space with the local community, they developed the idea of making the space a permanent library that gathered a collection, and they called it Pollyanna. Pollyanna offered artists and curators a flexible platform to experiment with new strategies of production and public engagement. The library and the permanent collections infrastructure was conceived to short-circuit the compulsory transience of rotating exhibitions, a model that 221A understands as embedded in the temporal logic of economic precarity. Pollyanna's collection actively responded to and developed with the fellowship's activity documents and materials accumulated in the researcher's fellow work with and was accessible to the public during the library's open hours. This format encouraged a sustained engagement and generative exchanges with publics throughout the researcher's fellows' time at 221A. Counters to the cycle of production and exhibition paradigmatic of cultural industries, Pollyanna favours an ecological model of social reproduction. The art institution is ferment or compost heap where ideas, actants and communities develop in cooperation. In addition to a shift towards educational programming and dialogical projects, Pollyanna will hence function as a free space for gathering and communal study, guided by a considered strategy of cultivating productive encounters between publics. Learning from notes of political ecologies, the generative potentials of building relationships and trust in a community neighbourhood and neighbourhood organisations will give key access to the library to host meetings and events. In a city where common space is deliberately enclosed and erased, Pollyanna became a space, a common institution, a public space, a common institution, an institution of the commons, where the making of culture and society will be and must be a communal endeavour. In Santiniketan, Vincent focused on the idea of the drifting classroom that he described from a 1972 to 1974 horror manga series about a school mysteriously uprooted and set adrift in a phantasmagoric wasteland. The students discover they've been transported into a future where Earth has been depopulated by a devastating cascade of environmental collapses. In the final chapter, the students receive a letter sent from the past. What we're capable of doing if we actually commit ourselves. Together in the drifting classroom, they begin to build a new society in the shell of the old. So these ideas of transforming new pedagogies within the reins of old structures was something that we were also thinking through with the students in Santiniketan, because their school had become a heritage site and in some way had enshrined the pedagogy in a way that had not allowed it to transform. We drifted through the library and allowed ourselves to wander and pick up books that we were interested in and spend a short time with before moving on to another. And when we shared our selection, we tried to see if there were any connections between the texts that we were drawn to. Sanchayan, as our host, also invited a number of practices from India that he felt would resonate well with the group. The Harvest School, organised by Dharmendra Prasad, began some weeks before the group arrived. Dharmendra felt that the relationship with the landscape needed to be recultivated. He describes the Harvest School as a seed of the future. The school happens in the fields, eco and rural settings of Bihar, Assam and beyond. This fluid and fragile post-studio condition attempts to rethink the time and the ways of living by practicing through the pedagogical, aesthetic and the ecological to produce care. The school practices harvest as a philosophical and futuristic possibility, which is largely influenced by the condition of the village, rural occupations and technology. The school works at the junction of rurality, ecology, art and pedagogy. Harvest School focus on producing the idea of care and inclusivity by unlearning the imperial attitudes, colonial practices, nationalistic and industrial ways of thinking and working. It is a process to realise and create the possibilities of non-capital ways of living, becoming the seed of the coming time, which is to be cultivated and being taken care, through toil, patience and waiting to be harvested for the need of life and time. As an eco-rural mechanic Harvest School practiced in the harvest fields, riversides, post-harvest sites, under the trees, nights and days, and different light intensities, and in multiple geographical, ecological, and cultural locations. Harvest School thinks through seasons, land, forest, wind flow, and becoming a part of the ecological machine. Harvest School and the village in the process of movements and flux, and the school is shaping building and changing itself according to the idea of the village changing in time. The school attempts to collect eco-occupational fragments from life as places for a new way of thinking pedagogy. What's the role and the aim of knowledge production in today's fragile and chaotic world? The school sees the notion of toil as the most important conceptual ingredient to imagine the Harvest School, not as the alternative, but as the insertion through coping with the pedagogical and the aesthetic space. The village and the ecology as memory and place and occupations as library plays a major role in defining the firm and the character of the pedagogical process as an aesthetic idea in the Harvest School. How to plant the rural memory in the field of ideas. How to preserve, generate a site of inclusion and a place of free thought with application of indigenous, rural, eco-ritual and techno-rural combination. How to think on a discarded knowledge system and reimagine the future through those. How to come up with a fluid harvest methodology for way of thinking pedagogy. Dharmendra Prasad was someone who really kind of understood this from his experience of growing up as a farmer's son and training as an artist, and although he trained as a painter, is now sort of very much thinking about how this notion of cultivating can be really supportive of the idea of cultivating care. The assistant professor of painting, Carla Bhavana, Darti Boro at the art school, and Claire Butcher, a curator of education for Toronto Biennial, came together to explore ideas around self, sustainability and natural resources in the preparation of meals. Meal times, like any other moment of the day, were especially important because of the way we came together. First of all, we were all quite overwhelmed with the number of people that we needed to feed, but Dartry and Claire held sessions with the students and the women from the village living locally as a mode of learning in the preparation of the meals. As different groups came to be served when they were finished, then those who had been served then became servers themselves until everybody had eaten. These ideas of sustainability are visibly exist in the traditional cooking methods of various indigenous people of northeast of India, although overconsumption and environmental degradation have impacted these traditional linkages that communities shared among themselves. Their culinary traditions try to meet their requirements without negotiating with modern market economies. Along with indigenous food culture of northeast India, this collaboration may explore traditional linkages existing in various indigenous culinary culture and other corners of the country through cooking process of making and sharing, the exchange of collective and individual experiences during the session. So it was really important to sort of see those moments of coming together and eating, not only as ones that were kind of just sort of nourishing our bellies, but ones that were also nourishing our conversation. We were putting together we were not putting together any radical practices per se, but we were encouraging dialogue between disciplines and recognizing that the painting department students had not had an opportunity to meet the sculpture students or the printmaking, and that as it wasn't part of their curriculum to think across these disciplines, the space for that had not been created. We are awaiting for the unexpected to happen. One of the students said, "We know each other, but we don't really know one another." And making space for the students to do this became a vital force of conversation and creation. So when preparing for you today, I realized that much of the work in making Under the Mango Tree is built on trust. Trust that we have common language and understanding that is intended. Although leading us to a gathering, there have been many conversations. So much of the workshops, interventions and moments are also reliant on those who wish to participate and be in dialogue. In the case of Santiniketan, we were on the grounds of the school of an open park. Many of the art students engaged with our program, but as workshops happen simultaneously and for different periods of time, depending on the nature of the workshop, group numbers varied. And one of the group of students who spent time with Shamila Samant, who's an artist and teacher, became a kind of peripatetic school within itself. They would visit other groups and Shamila would spend time discussing after their experience in depth the ideas and concepts brought up through the workshop. And it is in this way that Under the Mango Tree operates as a gathering of practices that are collectively shared and find their feet in the invitation. We have been invited by Jorge Gonzalez from the Escuela de Oficios in Puerto Rico in 2022, and we hope that we will find a resonance locally that draws on the experiences of the last two gatherings. We have been very fortunate in most of the collaborators and people who have joined us in our conversations and in our unlearnings and in our gatherings. So we look forward to meeting more practices. What I have learned from Jorge, who attended both editions and brought his students with him to Santiniketan, is the conversation can last over years. He selects his conversation partners with localities very carefully, looking for synergies, but also being open to learn new practices and sharing those practices through teaching them. This continual weaving of practices through, up and over each other develops over time, and it is within this web that that Under the Mango Tree operates in a perpetual motion of learning and unlearning. Thank you for listening.
Obrigado, Sepake.
Thank you, Sepake. For those who haven't seen us, so now we're going to have Tainá de Paula, and then we have a Q&A session. You can send us your questions through the chat on YouTube. I have the honor to introduce Tainá de Paula. She's an architect, urban planner, and activist of urban struggles, a specialist in she's a holder of master's degree in urban planning from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and currently she's co-president of the Institute of Architects of Brazil, a member of the Tender Commission of the Board of Architecture and Urban Plan of Rio de Janeiro, regional coordinator of the BR Cities Project, and advisor to the Center for Defense and Human Rights of Bento Rubião Foundation and the Reginami NGO. She has worked in several urbanization low-income housing projects, providing technical assistance for movements for fighting for housing. And today she assists the Bairro a Bairro movement, where she works as an architect and community mobilizing the outskirts. Tainá, you have the screen and you have 40 minutes. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and speaking after Sepake. It was a brilliant talk, so it's going to be very difficult for me to come now. I think that is very convenient to speak here about, well, I'm not that young anymore, but still young from the point of view of production and reflection. But this is a very important moment for the country to consider certain points for reflection in different fields, and especially I believe that within the context of a talk at the General Assembly with our President at the United Nations, and in this democratic context in Brazil of an attack to art, culture, to knowledge and sciences in general, I think that undoubtedly we have to understand the directions or the pathways for this obscure environment and this exchange of several proposals and discourses in the field of arts. Today, in the education and art in general in Brazil, I think that the discussion of educational process that we have is not only based on cultural education of heritage. We also base ourselves on the heritage based on what we want to build to the future. And we have to see what pathways have brought us to this collapse, to this institutional crisis that we have. This is a civilization crisis that we've been facing. And this consolidates what we see for the future, and worst of all, for this, what we see for this tragic moment to build our country and to build democracy in the way that we have been trying to do with hard difficulties in the last few years. I would like to ask someone to share my presentation. I would like to share the screen now. If not possible, I would like to share from here. I have brought a couple of images that will help me to build this dialogue over these 40 minutes. It's very important for us to understand the past. So let's see if we can have the images. One of the major pillars of the discussion of art and the curatorial processes, so the curatorial processes that we have in the arts, generally speaking, is a reflection based on the construction of value that we have seen as a collective subject and also as social and individual subjects that have the power of choice, the power of valuing, and the power of aesthetic decision. I think that we can also discuss this a little bit more, and especially to build the value legacies, the legacies of memory, artistic heritage of a society. It's very important for us to reflect what we have accumulated over the years as a society and what is our culture and artistic repertoire for this, which were our references and which were the ways that have brought us to this landscape now. Of course, we cannot do here a very deep economic and social analysis of Brazil here, but Brazil is, by and large, is the country that has the highest inequalities, and it has one of the highest distances or gaps in terms of income of people. And this inequality is something that has led us to create an analysis on these processes. These are processes that have forged this inequality. So in this sense, it's very important for us to understand how the society and Brazilian cities were consolidated, what are the narratives that were perpetuated over this construction of repertoire of images, value, and contribution in art and culture. I think that this is pretty much the synthesis of the 20th century. Undoubtedly, one of the major contributions that I bring come from the urban planning and the discussion of the arts in this urban materiality.
Most examples come precisely from architecture. This is a picture from Rio de Janeiro, a picture that shows us the Valongo Pier, showing us this place, that historical place, that which we can see the proposal that was made in the architectural proposal that made at the Valongo Pier. It's one of the few piers that remains from the slave trading period. From slaves were brought to Rio de Janeiro, and this pier came up through renewal of the city and a project, and it's part of Africa. It's very important for us to realize that though the intention of the project was to add value and create a new rip of images of the city, a city that would remember what would be its original architectural setting and what was the black memory of the city, what's one of the blackest cities in the country. Even though there were initiatives to decolonize or post-colonialize, to treat this environment, it's important for us to understand that the whole setting of this place downtown that was deeply marked by racism in the city, with the erasure of memories and appropriations and ownerships by black persons in the urban space. This was placed under the label Little Africa. Rio de Janeiro is large Africa, and it's important for us to understand that these people who called this place Little Africa, as well as the intellectuals, the urban builders, the specialists in heritage, who took over 100 years, or actually 200 years, to take back from the past this Valonga Pier, were people that belonged to a certain social strata, hegemonically white from the higher social strata, and who were the ones who had ownership on the territorial identity and its lasting existence. And it's important for us to realize that it's very difficult for us to understand the inner workings of our real memory and real sense of society, of permanence, of continuity. It's very difficult for us to record and understand the times and the real symbols that must be valued. And I always like to bring up this picture. That is the picture of what was left of Canudos, the scene of the ruins that remained of Canudos, of an historical fight at the onset of at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, that showed the occupation of peripheral areas around towns, of the main towns of the country at the time in Brazil. And I mean by that Salvador, Minas Gerais, and Rio de Janeiro. Several favelas and several peripheral low-cost towns came up from this and were the remains of this war. And we have very little memory and records of this period in time, of the importance and the cultural legacy and heritage and historical legacy of Canudos, and this urban migration of Black people within Brazil, and also more pragmatically a great difficulty to show future generations the importance of these social and historical subjects who were the dwellers in these places, as well as taking to show them. There is also another picture which shows the extreme difficulty of creating possible futures for these urban subjects who are displaced. And in speaking practically, the Brazilian cities as they were planned after slavery, cities were built in a formal and colonial way, with setting aside fully these new urban subjects and erasing the possibilities of utopias and belongings. What am I saying here? What I mean is that Brazilian cities, in the process of cruel colonization, slavery, and subjecting of people that consolidated their territory in the 20th century, established institutional racism, territorial racism, and impossibility of other possibilities that made the creation of erasure and annihilation of possibilities a reality. They created the lack of importance, the banalization of lack of public spaces for these peripheral areas or for the favelas. Cities in the north have can deal with possible utopias in building, and when building intangible images in contemporaneity and in the creation of allegories and repertoires of images that are almost abstractions. And I have here this example of the Singapore trees. These solar trees are made possible in the context of a society that understands as possible the distribution of the high distribution of privilege and urban capacities. What I mean is Brazilian cities, states that we have when we think about these urban subjects, the possibilities of cities and the possibility of being able to create other fates is directly linked to subjection and submissions of our social individuals, bearing in mind the high inequality and the annihilation, the institutionalized genocide that we have today. This is quite clear. This process is directly linked to a large process, namely enslaving in nature, and a process of continuity and the preservation of inequality. So on the one hand, we have to take into account dystopic reality, or so to speak, dystopic reality, something the country should have the highest level of hydrological reserves in the world, and at the same time, as a country in which 50% of the population has no access to sanitation or clean water. It's a country that has built the whole 20th century based on developmental and agricultural development, and has reached the 21st century with problems of lack of water in the cities and the lack of essential services, and lack of even malnourishment as well. So it is important for us to be quite clear on how caught we are in the dynamics of annihilation of possibilities and desires and possibilities of creating futures, as well as we are subject to the perpetuation of a model of reality that cuts our access to intangible trees. On the other hand, and still talking about the processes in which we try to understand better this annihilation and this contemporary dystopia, I really like this allegory created by this collage, which is the favela, one of the favelas in Brazil that were built after Canudos, based on Canudos, as we saw in one of the slides, with a tree with the name favela. The name of favela is given to that tree, and this favela that is based on the first favela created in Rio de Janeiro is not literally a favela. It's one of the largest initial favelas in the city of Rio de Janeiro, and we have recordings of this occupation of the territory after Canudos. This collage sets a setting that is related to the great difficulty that we have to look to the other person, to look at another repertoire, at another ensemble of cities that is not the one we are used to. and it's not in our repertoire of images. So we have a total collapse of repertoires, and we are in a situation we do not know exactly what is this repertoire or construction of Brazil. We have today, very frankly, we have a great difficulty to understand recent history. Chronologically speaking, in Brazil, we have a great difficulty to talk about slavery, to talk about the military dictatorship. We have a president that, in addition to being in denial, reinforces and strengthens some aspects that are absolutely unquestionable. We talked about the fake news in 2018. Fake news are a phenomena of this new virtual era that is ultra capitalist, that create virtual coups in the world. And this is a problem that we have been having in Brazil. The North American have the same problem as well. And it's linked to all these problems and to the situation that many countries go through that are ultra-conservative as well, and in which very conservative powers are on the ascent. Catalonia recently had elections, and the main fake news there was the progressive candidate would cut down the Ramon. Here in Brazil, we have images of a candidate who was wearing a T-shirt, Jesus is a transvestite, and the picture was the only one shown in the media, and people actually believed that this Photoshop was a real picture. And we have, of course, this ultra-conservative trend that uses these lies and distortions to influence us. On the other hand, and we have to talk about that in the civilization process and in art, and in my opinion, Brazil needs broad reform of its educational process and system. Being a woman of the arts, architecture, and I see architecture as a space of learning, aesthetics, and semiotics. This should be the basis of a nation. How can we cut down the possibilities of understanding, judging languages, potentialities of interpreting designs and pictures and images? Our population was plunged in a repertoire of fake images and fake news and lies, and has not assimilated codes and repertoires that would allow it to think freely, to look at the picture in WhatsApp and be able to identify a lie from a Photoshop picture, from a true picture. And the visual repertoire of the country must be debated. What we can see is what we see. What do we interpret from the pictures? From the moment that we are born to the moment which we go to school, we are overwhelmed by the number of information and pictures, and we must not only focus on information and content, but we can't hope that fake news will end, but we must hope that transformation of education and culture will take place. I want to believe that we'll be able to create a repertoire of tools for empowerment and transformation and understanding of reality that will be such that people will be able to see and will be empowered to create their own repertoires and their own narratives and be free not only to choose, but to choose what political trend they wish to support. In that sense, it's important for us to state that if we build a nation that is emptied of its images, its references, its memories, if we build a nation in which sectors of society use the frailty of education, of culture, and of economy to exert their power, to impose it, democracy will go through a very fragile moment. We will be having false faithfuls and false narratives to perpetuate a process of subjugation and self-control. And once again, during the 20th century, we built and strengthened somehow two main problems. One was the non-elimination of inequality, and that was the role of art, of the main arts and their main spokespeople and tools were created for a given social stratum. We were unable to diversify and entrench access to art as a constitutional right based on real values and strengthened by a budget and policies. We had very recent achievements from the standpoint of cultural instrument access to notices and call for offers and presentations and capitalization of IFAN. During the 20th century, we trained our first baby steps to give full access to art, to the production of culture and to exhibition spaces and cultural platforms and digital platforms that are still very few in Brazil. Access to digital art is very limited. Access to the internet is very limited. We have a number of channels and platforms. Since I hope the next biennials will
and
ser descolonizada, entendendo os seus principais gargalos de avanço, e um dos principais gargalos de avanço é a perpetuação de desigualdade, claro, o racismo, a LGBTQI-fobia, a misoginia, construídas de forma muito entranhada nesse Brasil. E aí, ao invés de a gente gastar o século XX construindo formas de emancipação desse povo, de construção de uma agenda antirracista decolonial forte, e que inclusive questionassem a tal ordem e o tal progresso, que é capaz, né, de ter um verde e amarelo numa bandeira, sem a gente se debruçar dessa cor verde, né, falar que um dos grandes crimes ambientais, né, que forjaram o Brasil foi a derrubada praticamente total da nossa Mata Atlântica para a plantação de pau-brasil. Depois continuamos nesse repertório ao longo do século produzindo produtos para exportação, para dar conta de toda a logística de commodities, e não refletimos. E vejam vocês, hoje a queimada do Pantanal, mesmo com cidades tendo chuva preta, tendo nevoeiros cinzentos, usando meia-noite no lugar do meio-dia, temos muita dificuldade de construir pauta ambiental no Brasil, porque o Brasil sequer se entende como uma grande reserva ambiental, um sistema que, na verdade, não é nem só nosso, é da Latinoamérica, é do mundo inteiro. A gente precisa construir, estabelecer em que medida, em que relação nós não demos conta desse século XX, de construir um repertório que construísse esses caminhos que entranham e consolidam os graves problemas que a gente tem hoje. Não, a queimada do Pantanal é o acúmulo de um errado e equivocado repertório da sociedade de país. E isso se dá no entendimento do extrativismo, qual é a nossa relação com o garimpo e quantas brumadinhos e quantos colapsos, quantas barragens nós teremos que enfrentar nesse século XXI para construir um repertório que nós precisamos de um novo pacto, e nós precisamos de um novo pacto civilizatório, social, radicalmente transformador, a partir da construção de novas imagens. Então, na minha opinião, houve um grande sequestro, né, das grandes imagens e referências visuais do país. Não vejo com conforto algum a possibilidade de usar uma camiseta verde para sair de casa. Não, uma pessoa muito conservadora, eu não sou a única pessoa assim, mas a ver é que nós vamos refletir, pelo menos, para além de questionar. O que está dado, né, nessa era pós-2018 é normalidade de imagem, de narrativa e de repertório, inclusive artístico. Vejam você, falando um pouco dessa guinada, né, e aí eu não gosto muito de usar a palavra guinada, porque parece que não é 2016, mas entendendo que saímos de um entendimento de convivência democrática com os diversos campos para uma nação amplamente dividida na ampla maioria das cidades, né, inclusive algumas cidades principalmente no sul do país e no sudeste, de um modo geral, com uma banalização do discurso de ódio, né, na hipermilitarização dos seus processos institucionais. Eu estou numa cidade, o Rio de Janeiro, que vive uma barbaridade de um milicianato consolidado, inclusive nas instâncias institucionais. Não é segredo para ninguém, para o mundo, que são da arte, ativismo e educação, porque não há nenhum outro lugar, para além do espaço e do repertório educacional, que vá ser capaz de construir nas novas gerações um contraponto ou uma outra construção repertorial, vamos dizer assim, do que foi consolidado em um curtíssimo período de tempo, eu diria, no cenário social brasileiro. Quem poderá desconstruir e mais possibilitar que esta guerra cultural, eu não gosto muito de usar a palavra guerra, porque eu acho que acirra a belicosidade do momento, mas, sem dúvida alguma, existe uma disputa cultural muito colocada entre o obscurantismo e esta outra coisa que precisa ser construída, porque eu não digo nem que é uma substituição. Eu acho que o obscurantismo brasileiro conseguiu sufocar, de certa forma, e fragilizar todo um campo da intelectualidade, todo um campo da produção cultural, que hoje se vê com muita dificuldade, inclusive do ponto de vista da segurança individual, né? Existe aí uma sanha persecutória, e aí eu estou falando tanto da retirada dos editais, estou falando tanto da destruição do Ministério da Cultura, quanto uma sanha de se estabelecer como um novo normal no campo das artes, né? Não à toa existem tantos elementos neofascistas ou nazifascistas colocados, tanto do ponto de vista dos vídeos como das imagens. Eu acho que todo mundo lembra do Alvin sentado como uma imagem clássica de Hitler. Bolsonaro performa e constrói imagens visuais muito alinhadas com retratos e com fotografias históricas de Hitler e em cenas memoráveis aí dessa triste história, na minha opinião, recente, da história mundial. Mas, sem dúvida alguma, e eu acho que o que a gente deve se debruçar é no que vem depois, né? Fiz uma aula recente com os alunos da Escola da Cidade, uma escola de arquitetura de São Paulo, que teve um título que eu acho que é muito o tom do que a gente deve começar a discutir, que é a sociedade sede de um processo imperial e colonialista, e depois pós-colonialista, e vestir uma capa democrática, né, e de construção de uma horizontalidade entre.
It also tries to show a horizontal society that is very difficult to show the inequalities and the racism that is embedded in it. Sorry, we have different audio coming together. There is a microphone open. So undoubtedly, the movement to build breakage with the colonial standards, with the modern gods, and with the movement of horizontality. And now I got the collectives, local construction, cities, people that bring in their heritage positive results from different potentialities that we lack in Brazil. What we call to be trivial contributions or trivial inputs from family, from something that you just inherit from your family, goes from generation to generation. We just make that trivial. We also think that the social environmental relationships of the original or native people or the Quilombola people has been something trivial. We have to see what are the new paradigms of value construction, especially to build repertoires in Brazil from now onwards. The movement that we see in Africa is very powerful because it says we want something new, but does matter. And we have to establish a social impact by saying that Brazilians are very important, every Brazilian is important, and from now onwards to build this future based on kind of a Brazilian revolution with our repertoire of a country. Now, to end my presentation, what I find fundamental is our cultural and ancestors representation. African-based religions are things that are very important for us to rebuild our heritage and the social values that are native to us. I think that the major advancement in building image and culture comes from the African ancestry art of movement, something as we can say like that. But what does matter are local repertoires and individuals that have to be put in this new repertoire of the future. Now, ready to end, we have to understand how today is being recorded or captured. Never photography has been so important for us. By understanding that we have to establish a new democracy in our country. I hope that after we go through these problems, we can think on a new constituent committee to write a new constitution, the new fundamental rights that will impact all the areas of the society. But mostly, we have to seek all the pathways that are possible for. We are more than hatred, obscurantism, we are more and more, and I'm sure that the curatorial pathways of Brazil will lead us to a new repertoire of a country and future. Thank you.
Obrigado, Tainá. Nós temos, então, bloco de...
Thank you, Tainá. So now we have 20 minutes for Q&A. Well, now we have 10 minutes more. We can go now to up to 6. So our legends. The first one is, how can we tell or narrate educational public programs that have already happened? Since the expansion of discursive practice under the banner of education within and beyond art museums and exhibitions 15 years ago, we have consolidated ways to tell and narrate things that refer to a set of concepts, questions, purposes, formats, and aims that are inspirational, as if the program were being launched again. Immediately, the feelings that they reinforce those previous concepts or refer to experiences in which we have not participated in. And this feeling is recurrent because there are developments and there are findings as well as there are consequences in terms of new, different or alternative forms of learning, exchanging, or being together are often sublated by the gesture of having triggered them. Two things seem to be missing here in these two narratives. The first one, a reflection on what had happened, and that could be shared artists or
O que você acha que mudou, que flutuou ou que permaneceu desde então? O que você acha que você, a instituição e outros agentes envolvidos aprenderam ou desaprenderam? Eu faço, na sequência, minhas perguntas para a Tainá.
Thanks for that question, Caio.
Muito obrigado por suas perguntas. São muitas perguntas. Eu não sei quanto tempo nós ainda temos para responder, então eu vou tentar responder as duas em diferentes maneiras. Eu espero que eu tenha entendido bem.
Eu posso primeiro fazer as perguntas para a Tainá e aí depois passo para você e depois sequência?
Ok.
Obrigado. Assim você já
tem
um tempinho para editar as minhas perguntas como você preferir. Bom, para Tainá, nos últimos dias eu assisti algumas de suas participações em seminários.
Participations in seminars and other discussions on the internet, which I recommend to those who are following us here. And what called my attention was your capacity to analyze and talk about the most diverse subjects pertaining to social, political, and cultural problems that we have to face in Brazil today, especially in the interface between with urban fighting. So that's why I felt I could ask you about anything. I would like to ask you a question on education, but perhaps on education and communication and play in cultural problems. In your speeches, I saw the number of syntaxes and connections, environmental racism, food genocide, structural reparation, political feminicide, and so on and so forth. I think these new terms cognitively have a very important role that requires us to think more, or rather think more about many more things at the same time. Faced with the task of creating a city and a society that will be totally decolonized, as you proposed in a recent conversation with Guilherme Wisnik, and assuming the reestablishment of conditions for a debate between differences and creating facing sectarisms that are highly disseminated between progressive systems. How do you do that in a context in which social life seems to be increasingly edited or twigged by the functioning of social media and networks, and where the space for change and for complexity of problems is increasingly narrower? I will give the floor to Sepake now for her to answer.
Thank you, Kaya. So in relation to your first question, which is very much thinking about, in some ways, epistemologies or histories and narratives and how they're held. And I was thinking about actually the significance or the importance of the library and the archive, not just as documents or witnesses, but actually also you might even include the ruin within that is able to kind of witness a kind of passing of events. Now, I think the difficulty potentially with the library or the archive or the ruin is that they need to be interrogated. So they need to be activated again. It's not enough that they exist. There has to be a rearticulation, a questioning, a curiosity to be able to make those connections. I think in Documenta 14, what kind of brought this question around alternative pedagogies and learning was really thinking about the convergences and conversations between these different radical pedagogues. We had the library of Lucius and Anne-Marie Burkhardt in our space, and because of that, we could see the relationship between a German teacher, sociologist in the School of Architecture and City Planning, and his interests in Paulo Freire, in Ivan Illich. And it was actually through this that I also recognized that once a year there was a gathering of these different pedagogues, that Ivan Illich had kind of created a space and would bring people together in order to kind of discuss what they considered to be urgent in terms of radical education practices. So maybe in some ways, Under the Mango Tree speaks to that history of bringing practices together, bringing conversations and creating convergences between practices. But I think you also raise another important point, which is about the audiences, so the publics that are created maybe, or the temporary communities that are created through these programs, and what happens to those experiences. Well, in some ways, there is a kind of collective body that is formed and comes together during these kinds of events. And there is an element of dispersal as well. And you sort of see that energy either dissipates or goes into different forms or formats. But one thing I definitely recognize is that there is a kind of cultivation of the public. And what I mean by that is that sometimes often large-scale exhibitions like Documenta sort of said to be looking at the kind of cutting edge, if I'm to use this word, or contemporary practices that are really at the front of their practice, and this often challenges the visitors to say, okay, this is the work that is at the forefront, and maybe it's using technologies that we are aware of, but are kind of used in different ways, or maybe in some ways it's the subject matter is difficult or uneasy to face in this kind of public forums. And what I actually found quite interesting with Documenta 14 was that it was not necessarily challenging the public with something that was the new. It was actually trying to recognize the practices of artists that have been practicing for a long time. And also even to bring into question, can something indigenous be contemporary? That for some people was, those two categorizations could hold the same space was quite difficult to actually recognize. So because of that, it means that potentially the next Documenta deals with something else. And so there is a continuum, maybe in the expectation, but there is a continuum also in, I've noticed, the shift of education and the place that it holds within that overall project. So maybe it could have been seen something that was on the periphery, and at one point it was looked at as very much something that was just education was something specifically for children, and actually was quite far away from the exhibition sites. But increasingly, education has been moving from the periphery, almost, I would say, let's see what Documenta 15 holds, but I would say almost to a central position, that modes of exchange and the practice of artists making itself is about making a kind of temporary community. So, I mean, we'll see where we go from that, but we also need to realize that the continuum can sometimes be reactionary. So maybe if this Documenta is the most discursive and socially engaged and politically engaged, maybe the next one will, completely refute that and again push education to the sides. And then just briefly, I think, on your second question about what did we learn and what did we unlearn, just very briefly, I would say to trust the process, not to try to determine an outcome, to work out how to listen, to embody, and to maybe even trust your own voice, to work out what it is and to be able to trust that, while trusting your body at the same time. So the combination, I think, of embodiment, of movement, of gesture in relation to something that actually Dieter Rollstrater said, this isn't, we are not just, eyes on sticks walking around an exhibition space. We have bodies. And so anything that is felt, it's not just felt through the eye alone. And I think that that's something that I've definitely carried with me in other projects and practices too.
Obrigado, Sepake. Bom, a gente pode
Thank you
ouvir.
very much, Sepake. Now we can hear Tainá's answer. Tainá, you have the floor. Well, you just provoked me with a question that is very much related to everything I say. So there's a great deal to say, but I thought it was great. I'm afraid I will talk a little too much. I won't have time. I will go back to reconstruction, on which I worked a great deal. And it may be a first path to your answer. I believe a path of the construction of our ontology, and I have focused a great deal on understanding the new concept that was my doctorate project, understanding the urban Brazilian diaspora, which is a new repertoire, a new concept of this diaspora that is a terminology that is very little studied in Brazil, way beyond the discussion of the African diaspora or the Jewish diaspora. My intention, and I see that actually we have had a number of Black intellectuals and Black women intellectuals who have who create on this or built in their analysis something that is very strong and urgent, which is this understanding of Brazil as a movement that precedes the educational process. I believe in changing the Brazilian educational process, but we have to understand based on what will be the syllabus, what will be more important, the abolition of blackness or the freedom of slavery law, the golden law. I hope it will be the names of the Black people who fought against slavery. And in a very recent discussion that is very much 21st century debate, and which it's not an end that will, a year that will end easily. We have this world pandemic in which we are questioning the fate of conservative governments, and we are wondering what the next few years will be like, or the future years will be like. And we hope that there will be a questioning of these administrations, not only in Brazil, but elsewhere. It's very important for us to think that this George Floyd movement in the United States led us to talk about, once again, heritage and construction based on the architecture of the cities, the symbolic values that are ingrained in cities. Let's talk about this once again. I've never talked so much about sculpture, art, and in my life, and with so many architects and urban planners talking about history and culture. They never they never thought so much about the statues and the people they represented as in 2020. And everyone, at least minimally, started in the heritage sectors, started to see that we had more Peter II statues than, and Duque de Caxias statues than we had Black people statues. We had no Black people in these places. In places where there was population. I see, therefore, that 2020 is, even though it's a very hard scenario in which we feel all this despair, and Brazil has over 137,000 deaths. It's a catastrophe from the standpoint of the world, and it's a very sad period, or at least should be a period in which we have a collective understanding, collective suffering and understanding, but that has been sort of trivialized. The sanitation crisis has been trivialized. I see nonetheless a window for some people and a window of opportunity. I don't know if it's an opportunity. However, 2020 opened a window that led us to see things with other eyes, through a new lens. And I think there's no going back. The discussion of racism and the questioning of questioning capitalism and the change of capitalism and COVID-19, those are important windows, strong windows that we must explore. And I will conclude by quoting some theorists of capitalism. There is a small guide that is available, and there is an article that I think is fundamental, everyone has to read. Capitalism suffered a Kill Bill from COVID-19. And I believe we need that to understand our cities. Thank you very much, Tainá. We've just reached the last minute of our time. I would like to ask you one last question and address it to the audience as well. So you give us one very, very, very quick answer. Well, that's the question. The first question to Sepake. Leda Guimarães asked about the Paulo Freire project. And you can imagine that question in Brazil. It would be interesting to think that we would have to talk about trees. I saw many trees in Tainá's presentation, and I was wondering if trees and if classes in the outdoors got a new meaning also after the pandemic. That's the question for Sepake. And for Tainá, the question comes from Rose Brazil on what would be the way to create a law that would incentive to culture, not just commercialization of culture, but have grassroots culture. And that's for Tainá.
So thanks for the question. I think most definitely that in this time, obviously around COVID specifically, and where enclosed spaces become difficult spaces for thinking and learning. Actually, a number of artists I know have been thinking very much about this notion of the forest school and its importance in education and learning, and thinking about the outdoor space again as a place to kind of operate from. Of course, there are temporal conditions, and depending on where you are in the world, and also depending on the kind of urban context, because actually for some schools they actually don't have outdoor space. So there is also this design consideration that we should also maybe reconsider the importance of indoor and outdoor spaces in the formation of the design for schools and spaces of gathering and coming together. But I think for sure there is also something I have to say about trees, which is in the same way I sort of talked about the archive or the library, that is a kind of witness of time, and time on a very different scale. Tainá talked about the importance of the rainforests in Brazil, not just for Brazil, but really recognizing for humanity. And there is this element right now where, not to be on a kind of pessimistic front, but where we have a sense of that we will get to a point where we will run out of our resourcing, So we have trees, but they take time to grow, and to have the kind of vast kind of forests and rainforests that we have, that takes time to grow. So understanding our kind of urgencies of thinking about reconnecting again with our landscape, and not in a just not in a way which is just about kind of viewing the landscape. It's not just about the eye. It's really about how do we understand that what we do and how we work in the world also has an effect, a direct effect on our landscape. But that landscape is also us, which also, of course, comes very much from a kind of indigenous thinking, that it's not just about a separation and understanding ourselves separate from nature, but to recognize that we are nature too. So I hope that if anything in this time, and maybe that's the optimistic front, that we reformulate a relationship to the outdoors.
Obrigado, Sepake. Tainá, por gentileza.
Thank you, Sepake. Tainá? Can I proceed? I hadn't heard you. Well, speaking about the democratization of culture in Brazil is something very difficult. And I really get caught, in sweat the sensation that there is just a tourismologist. Of course, I respect their profession very much, but of course, we have difficulty in building this agenda of culture and heritage at the Institute of Brazil of Heritage, and the difficulties that we have in our institutions. You know, there is an agenda of a collective delirium in democratization, access to art, and more than that, the inclusion of new cultural repertoires and new cultural outputs in this landscape. The first thing that we have to make clear is that we have our democracy, the role of the state, and we have seen that in the COVID-19, the role of the government was vital to ensure the survival of many in face of this pandemic. So I think that it should be 0001 in the progressive democratic agenda. The other thing is how we think democratization of cultural policy that includes the diversity and call for papers, and also considering the diversity in the access of Black people, LGBT people, and how can we diversify considering how we build this cultural repertoire and how we invest in the periphery uh, culture and pop art and how all this is built in the cities, how we can strengthen this in the municipalities and the debate on a budget that is exclusive to culture. I'm speaking about the second largest city in the country, Rio de Janeiro. We have less than 1% of the budget that is assigned to culture. And there is no judicialization or criminalization of management that doesn't really handle it efficiently. There is negligence, especially when we discuss the budget of culture. And this is a debate that we have led to the Ministry of Culture itself, and access to art and culture, and has to do with the output of knowledge. So, in all this landscape, what should we do? I think that we have to go beyond this institutional moment, and this is necessary. We cannot speak based on a utopia, saying that everything will, everything will be all right. No, nothing is all right. And of course, I think that we are able to build this new repertoire in a new scene of culture in Brazil. Thank you very much, Tainá. I would like to thank you very, very much. And Sepake, we would love to continue with this conversation. We were very lucky to have both of you here today. But unfortunately, we have to move on to the next session, which is a special ceremony. We have Giselle Begeman, and she's going to announce the winners of this edition of the seLecT Award for Art and Education. So, Giselle, you have the word, you have the floor. Sorry. Thank you very much, Caio. Thank you very much, Sepake, Tainá, for enlightening this cold afternoon in the city of Sao Paulo. Good afternoon, or nearly and is from now onwards, or is right now a landmark, not because of the 700 registrations or subscriptions that we have received from all across the country, and not because for the first time in the categories of trainer and artist, most of the projects nominated to the award and by the selection jury are non-white applicants with a strong presence of women, especially in the category of trainers, and the predominance of Black people, brown people, and indigenous people. The list of the nominated people in these categories, artists and trainer, serves as the basis for this edition. To be a landmark. But what really makes this edition of the seLecT Award a divide is that the first and fundamental point defined by Moacir dos Anjos and historian and curator Renata Bettencourt and journalist and curator Luana Fortes, members of the selection jury, evidenced that culture resists and reinvents itself as a disruptive front, as a counterpoint to all the forms of ignorance and institutional dismantling that we are living now. This vector has mirrored in the selection of the jury. And this is what we see in the group of finalists that gather a meaningful set of projects. These projects are related to the agendas of gender and race. Together, they will cover the demands for the creation of repertoire for the recognition and political inclusion and cultural inclusion in the indigenous matrices, in the place of disabled people, the problematization of violences of gender and race, and the construction of the territories of the commons and shared life. Of course, based on this landscape, you can imagine that there are much more reasons for you to celebrate this third seLecT Award of Art Education. However, it is with a mixture of sadness and happiness that I come here to announce the results of this edition. I had the honor of chairing the jury of the seLecT Award since the first edition, 2017. The seminar that we put up then happened shortly after the coup that put Temer in the power in an impeachment process that made President democratically elected Dilma Rousseff in power. At that time, we were looking forward to see what will happen to the political and educational cultural issues. While the government was proposing to extinguish the mandatory teaching of arts, philosophy, and sociology in high school, and also the extinction of the Ministry of Culture. The second edition occurred together when there was a presidential campaign in 2018. The ceremony was held in Brasilia 1 week precisely after the burn that simply destroyed the National Museum a few months after the election of Jair Bolsonaro. And the flames did not end. On the contrary, they simply are now covering our country from the Amazon to the Pantanal. Our historical heritage and the memory and the heritage of this country has been subject to several series of assaults to negationist theories that are just disdaining the agendas of gender, race, and culture, and confronting the pain of those who descend from the enslaved people, the areas that are demarcated for indigenous lands, and the institutions are responsible for the preservation of our history, like IFAM and Casa de Rui Barbosa. Since the beginning of 2018, we have had 3 ministers of education and 5 special secretaries of culture. In view of this global pandemic that has already killed 130,000 people in Brazil, we now see our 3rd Minister of Health. Systematic attacks to the universities and federal institutions have become recurrent. Dequalification of artistic output and their institutions, the same thing happened in the state of Sao Paulo. A bill of law 529 sent by Governor João Dória to the Chamber of Representatives proposed to remove from public state universities like USP, UNICAP, Unesp, and FAPESP the superavit that ensures their autonomy in view of the economic issues and threatening and compromising the future of research, science, and knowledge. Say no to PL 529. How can we think education and art within this context? In several moments in our seminar, it was very clear that this is a time to disobey. Dralongo Bahia, artists and they are decisive to break this stagnation and the stability that ensure the permanence of the powers that conspire against what encompasses. Something that Sepake Angiama also brings to us when she proposed to unlearn to get free, as she declared to the seLecT magazine recently in an interview and also today. Actually, we need to take away the obedience that philosopher Frederick calls to be stupid, because it assumes the absence of reasoning and growth is the one that I would like to quote now. Insurrection is not decided. It empowers by a collective when the ability to disobey together comes back to be sensitive, contagious, when the experience of the unbearable gets even stronger until it becomes a social evidence. The question, therefore, as Rose points out, is not the one made by Thoreau and its Treaty for Civil Disobedience. If I'm not, who will be in my place? But rather of Hillel, the old person who questioned, if I don't go by myself, who will go? But if I go only for myself, who will I be? Let's contagiate people together. In this direction, now I would like to read the statement of the award jury composed by Paula Zugaray, curator and creator of the seLecT Award of Art and Education, Heloísa Buarque de Holanda, professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and pioneer of studies of feminists and the connection of university with the peripheries. Diane Lima, independent curator with a master's degree in communication semiotics from the Catholic University of São Paulo, and Valeria Toloi, manager of education at Itaú Cultural, to announce those who have won the categories of a trainee artist of this award. And this process that started in July, including the selection of those nominated for the award, selection of the finalists, and putting up the seminar to discuss their works with the jury. Camisa Educação winner, in a partnership with André Gino and Luísa Coimbra, summarizes the motivation of this effort. Education is the emergency exit. We have learned a lot with the 11 finalists of this award. We have learned, for example, we have learned to listen to other voices with musical translations of Anne Magalhães to sign language, and the podcast of today of Eduana Gama Canto and their partners. We also have learned to operate in the key of the garbage key that go beyond the boundaries of bodies with Vicenta Pirota and Lado Vigi Medeiros. We have also expanded our horizons on indigenous contemporary culture with Gustavo Caboclo and Ana Puaca Muniz Tupinambá, who have re-educated us for the coexistence with decolonial postures in view of the traditional canons. This guideline is one that structures the Galeria Rio Culpa together with the MSTC when we see the dispute. Not only there are narratives, but also because of the right for housing and life. Decolonizing something that is necessary, but this also includes occupying other spaces like the water of our rivers and other exposition formats that are meant with and for other audiences, as shown by André Vitor Brandão da Silva, the ideator and curator of Mostra Flutuante no Rio de São Francisco. We have to be able to create other relationships of learning and listening that will also imply the touch, the discovery of the pain of the other one by the body and the skin, which are central in the work of Antônio Tarsis de Jesus Miranda and Renata Aparecida Felinto. In the Fomento Araparu Award, the jury has selected as an artist category Renata Felinto, whose work combines relational procedures of the African culture to reflection and sensory exercises with poetic practices as a movement to become aware or to raise awareness to the otherness. In this category of the artist, we would like to highlight the work of Gustavo Caboclo, who through a sensitive work of research in the field of oral history, finds his identity of indigenous ancestry. By consolidating his project in the book, a cultural object that is now being attacked as is typical of authoritarian governments in the history, Gustavo shows the ways of politicization of sensibility and decolonization of collective imagery. Bas Kawau Campo, After the Fire, is the title of his work that serves as an essay to the response of the context of devastation, destruction of heritage, and also the futures that we live, saying in the category of trainers, the Prêmio Fomento Arapuru, the jury has selected the work of Galeria Rio Culpa by highlighting its unique character of articulation between culture and politics based on the collective making things, based on an intersocial network of agents that are compromised with the need of change of the structures of possession and property that are very much embedded in the Brazilian society. In the same category, we have selected to the Select Award the project De Hoje a Oito, podcast of literature focused on the cultural production of Recôncavo Baiano and and African Portuguese literature represented by one of their creators, Eduarda Gama Canto. Based on its regional focus and inventivity to occupy the city with loudspeakers on poles and in a space with a local radio, the podcast sign shows forms to reinvent the word and communication by means of a radical pedagogy of intellectual generosity. To all the participants, we would like to give them our acknowledgement. As our major educator Paulo Freire used to say, happiness does not only come with the finding, but is part of this process of searching. Do not stop.
Eu chamo agora.
And now I will call the winners of a Camisa
Now the
Educação
winners of Camisa
category.
Educação Award,
Andrea,
Andrea,
Luisa,
Luisa,
are you
are
there
you now
already?
here?
Hello. Hello, I'm there. We're there.
A palavra é de vocês.
Well, you have the floor. Hello, I'm Luisa Coimbra. And we have Andrea Higino with us. We'd like to thank seLecT magazine and the members of the jury for their work and for this very important award that's so important for art and education in the very vulnerable situation Brazil is going through right now in terms of education and precarization of education. We believe that the safety exit is education. This is why this award is so important. And we thank you for the visibility and the recognition given by this award. Hello, good evening. I'm Andrea Higino, and I would also like to thank the seLecT magazine team and the award team and the members of the jury and the work Luisa and I made together since 2017 is something that was born at the university. We are artists who went through the process of education and art education together. We learned about contemporary art and we understood that we could be artists within the University of the State of Rio de Janeiro, and this is why our work of creation, our research, our artwork never separated itself from education. We believe that public educational spaces must be preserved and defended because they are spaces that democratize knowledge and culture, and our work speaks precisely of dedication and in a resilient voice. As educators, we work, we can produce and we can be at the forefront of these safety exits, even though the government tells us that's not the case. And I would like to thank you all, thank all the participants and all the members of the jury. Thank you. And now I give the floor and I will call to receive the award. For me, artist Renata Felinto. Is Renata there? Is Renata here? Let's wait for Renata to come in. So she can receive virtually, symbolically, the award that she was given. And meanwhile, I'll introduce, is Renata there?
Renata?
Renata, are you there? Renata must be facing some problem to connect, and I will now call the winners of the inaugural edition of Fomento Arapuru in the trainers category. We have a few persons already there? Are they here? Galeria Rio Ocupa did not manage to come in either. Well, I will reverse and I will now call the artist who was awarded the seLecT award. Gustavo, are you here? You have the floor. Gustavo, yes, you can unmute yourself. Yeah, you have the floor and the screen. Hello, breathing here. Breathing, coming in, trying to slow down a little. And yes, this is it. Always starting from this start point of the raising of repertoires. It's very good to be here and to keep on going on this creation of what's symbolic and also practical issues. We'll go on telling our stories and talking and making dialogues. I'm here still thinking about these fields that are on fire, and after the fires, we have here the ashes and the Gustavo, thank you very much. Congratulations. And on behalf of all the jury and the whole team, I would like to congratulate you. I will now go back to the presentation to the public of the winner for the first time. We have this first Fomento Arapiru, Renata Felinto. She has the floor now, and she has the floor. I don't know what happened to my screen, and I think I could not come in. I'm unable to. I will move on to the other awards, and then I'll come back to you. Okay? Okay. Now here I am. Now it worked. That's great. Good evening. I would like to thank everyone involved in the project, the 25 persons who were with me and made available their time, their stories, their pains, and who allowed me jointly with them to think about ways in which we could heal ourselves and find in art a strong channel to heal ourselves and to re-educate society. This has a great deal to do with Tainá de Paula's speech. We must reconnect to the populations, the peripheral populations, the black populations, the quilombolas, all these ways of lives who were erased and who were basically erased from history. So it's with great joy that I uncovered this covered zone done by history. I would like to thank Renata Picones, Moacir dos Santos, and Luana Fortes, who have selected this project. And I would like to thank the Paula Zagorai, Johnny Lima, Eloise and Eloisa Barca de Holanda, for having the sensitivity to allow me to pursue my work. I'd like to congratulate all my colleagues who were selected, because these are works of art that go beyond the market, that go beyond the idea just of work of art. The artist who wants to produce for education faces a double challenge. It's a challenge to create art, but to think about a work of art something that can increase the potential of education is even more challenging, and it involves some financial return as not being the only end or fate for this work. Thank you very much, Renata Sabrowski, for your beautiful work that is so important. Going back to the initial order of our list, I will call the representative of Rio Culpa Gallery to receive the award of Fomento Arapuru. This is the first time that this award is given by seLecT Awards. It's a special category. It is a promotional category to encourage, and I therefore call the representative of Rio Culpa Gallery, who represents the gallery here, and he's represented by Carmen Silva, who comes back to us. Carmen, please, you have the floor. Carmen, we can see your microphone that is still muted. Go on, you can speak. Yes, unmute yourself. Well, here am I. I would like to greet everyone who is here. I'm coming in now. I had a little problem to connect. And just to be here, I'm so thankful. And I'd like to thank you, everyone, for their sensitivity. Everyone who is here is very sensitive to art. And I understand that art is it's not just for entertainment. Art is life. And increasingly, I see the change art brought to my life and to the life of people who were in the MSTT movement, because we were able to liberate our soul. We always had a political view, but we had no voice. Often we wanted to shout, and at the same time that this voice was imprisoned within us, we could not shout. And so just to be able to be here is wonderful. And I would like to say, don't stop, because art is life. Art is art frees you. That's it. Carmen, thank you very much for your words and for the encouragement that you are for all of us. You know that you are a guiding star, and that you have a very special role. You have a very special place as well, going against this dismantlement that we see, not only because you are one of the great coordinators of art in the country, but also because you are a benchmark in the fight for housing and for life as a right to be in the city. Thank you very much for your participation and for being here with us tonight. Finally, and not that this end is a beginning, I will call Eduardo Gamacanto, who represents the podcast, today's podcast, and you have the screen and the microphone. Come in. Thank you very much, Gisele. I can say on behalf of all the team that we're very, very happy to be here. And I would like to thank everyone who were part of the construction of Veja 8. And I believe that this is a historical selection, seeing a project that is come from the countryside of Bahia and have it selected. And it's made by a black woman. I'm short of words here. And so I would like to thank all the members of the jury and the seLecT team for being here. We were facing, just being at the finals, among the finalists was quite a victory for us. So to receive this award is quite an honor, and we're very happy. And now we'll give continuity to our project with a great deal of focus, and I will repeat here Renata's words. What she said was very important. I would like to congratulate everyone who got their awards and is here among these panelists. It was a pleasure to get to know your work, everyone's work. Thank you. Eduarda, we thank you for this opportunity of meeting you, knowing you, and take part somehow in your project and your brilliant trajectory, that the path you have ahead, and this fight against the dismantlement of education, culture, art, and thoughts of possibles and probables. I will now give the floor for the final words to Eduardo Saron and Paula Sudarai. And I thank you all for your attentions and for being here. And I hope we'll keep on disseminating together the culture. Thank you. Saron, you have, or Paula, you have the floor. So will you wrap up our ceremony? It will be an honor to have you with us here for these final words. Paula, you have the floor. Well, my dear friends, I can only thank you all for this learning process, for this wonderful process of getting to know you, meeting you, these projects. I now want to follow you closely. And I would like to thank with all my heart the team who was wonderful. We have a strong bond. Tonight, this evening was a strong bond, and we'll keep on moving forward. We'll go forward very thankfully for everyone. Thank you very much, and I wish you the utmost happiness. And we now wrap up the award ceremony of the third edition of the seLecT Awards, and let's hope many other awards will come, and long live education, art, and culture. Thank you very much to all of you who were with us in this process. Thank you.